Hi, I'm Alan Dove, and, y'all might not want to stand over there. That side's going to get kind of messy. Okay, so if you watched my first two videos, you understand how to think like a scientist. Now let's put that skill to work on some real scientific controversies that have been in the news lately. Last week, there was a sort of celebrity debate about creationism versus evolution. In one corner, we have creationists who believe in a literal interpretation of Genesis. That's the first chapter of the Bible, for those of you who slept through Sunday school. Genesis, at least in a literal reading of the King James translation, says the universe was created in 6 days. That's pretty different from what geologists and biologists believe, which is that the universe took about 13 billion years to develop, and life evolved on Earth over the last 3 billion or so. Now, this is obviously debate about facts, so let's look at it scientifically. First, we should ask if both theories are really science. Remember, science is universal, so a scientific theory should work equally well for everyone. But wait a second. If creationist theory is based on a literal interpretation of Genesis, it won't work for Hindus, will it? Or Buddhists? Or atheists? Come to think of it, it won't even work for Catholics, because the Pope called it a misinterpretation of the Bible a while ago. So creationism isn't a valid scientific theory. Evolution, on the other hand, doesn't rely on a particular religious viewpoint. It's just based on data, so it is a valid theory. Well, that was easy. Gotta wonder what all the fuss was about. Okay, let's move on. If you spend much time watching TV, you'll eventually hear someone talking about fairy tale beasts living in the real world. There was a supposed documentary just recently about mermaids. There's a reality TV series about people hunting Bigfoot, and space aliens and flying saucers seem to come up all the time. Those all sound like they're claiming to be facts, so let's try science again. If Bigfoot exists, he'd certainly exist for everybody regardless of their religion, so the claim passes the first test. It could be science. Now, is it a legitimate theory? Well, we have to be able to test a theory. It has to at least be possible to disprove it, remember? So how would we disprove the existence of Bigfoot? Wow, that would be kind of tough. Actually, really tough. We'd have to pretty much cut down every forest everywhere to be sure we'd eliminated his hiding places, and even then, how could we be sure he hadn't just moved to Hollywood to make a living as a Chewbacca impersonator? The theory is impossible to disprove, and nobody's found any hard proof of it either. And when we ask Bigfoot believers if they have anything besides grainy 8mm footage of a guy in a fur suit, we just get a lot of lame excuses. It's the same pattern for all these other mystery beasts, too. If we keep pressing for evidence, we eventually hear that it's been suppressed by a conspiracy of scientists who want to hide the truth. That's kind of like a second grader saying the dog ate his homework. Scientists are a bunch of skeptics who are always trying to find out the truth and prove each other wrong, remember? They'd be the worst people in the world to involve in a conspiracy. But we don't know everything, so it's possible Bigfoot and mermaids and little green men all exist, right? Well, sure. It's just as likely as Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy and the Easter Bunny. We can never totally disprove any of these things because they're all just stories people made up. Until someone trawls up a mermaid in a fishing net or drives into town with Sasquatch strapped to his hood, we should assume they don't exist. Now let's try another controversy. You've probably heard about global warming or climate change. As you learned in elementary school, the Earth has an atmosphere that absorbs heat from the sun. Yeah, I know that's a model of Nabu. I didn't have a globe handy. Work with me. Anyway, climate change is the theory that certain gases, especially ones like CO2 that come from burning fossil fuels, are making the atmosphere a better insulator, kind of like putting a greenhouse over the ground. As that happens, the average temperature of the whole atmosphere will go up. It could be colder in some places and much hotter in others, but the average will be upward. That would melt glaciers and the polar ice caps, flood cities, generate more extreme weather patterns, and generally make disasters much worse and more frequent. In other words, it would really, really suck. It's fair to say that we're all extremely biased against this theory. So let's check it out. It certainly passes the first test for science. Temperature is temperature, no matter what you believe. It definitely passes the second one, too. It would be really easy to disprove climate change. All we have to do is look at historical temperature records from as many places as possible and see if they correlate with fossil fuel use. What we see is, damn, temperatures are going up faster and faster since the Industrial Revolution, which definitely fits with fossil fuels causing it. Okay, let's try again. We could look at glaciers and see how they've advanced and retreated over the centuries. That shows the same thing. And we get the same pattern pretty much everywhere else we look, too. Every time someone comes up with a really good test that could disprove climate change, they end up finding evidence that it's true instead. Understandably, some people are having a really hard time facing up to these results. Remember what I said about science not always telling us what we want to hear? This is Exhibit A. The folks who are still denying climate change tend to use a few different rationalizations. First, they cherry-pick the data. That means that instead of looking at the whole mountain of evidence that climate change is happening, they harp on one or two details that they say disprove it. If a group of people goes on and on about just one or two scraps of evidence and ignores everything else, they're probably fooling themselves. And if we press them about this, climate change deniers eventually say that there's, you guessed it, a conspiracy of scientists trying to fool everyone. The climate is changing and we're causing it, and trying to rationalize it away isn't helping. What should we do about it? Well, that's where science ends and murky stuff like ethics and policymaking take over. We could implement a carbon tax or a cap and trade program or subsidize renewable energy, or just ignore it and let our grandchildren deal with it. The only option that's not on the table anymore is denying it. Facts don't negotiate. So that's how to think about scientific controversies. First, ask if the theory is universal. Second, ask if we can test it. Third, look at the results. All of the results. And finally, don't buy silly excuses if someone's evidence comes up short. We may not always like the answers science gives us, but they sure beat lying to ourselves. Thanks for watching.